It's 2 years until Germany goes to the polls again, but the establishment is worried. Two recent local election victories for the hard-right Alternative for Deutschland party has suggested that there could be real support for a political movement that is anti-immigration. Could the AfD make a splash in national elections too? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. Electoral success for the AfD has, until now, been largely confined to the European Parliament. AfD is a controversial party that some describe as far-right, while others claim that label as a slander. But either way, are the two recent local victories in the first glimpse that it's a serious contender in German national politics?
The AfD won power in two local elections in the country's east. It's their first success since being formed in 2013. Robert Sesselmann was elected as district administrator, the equivalent of a mayor, in the town of Sonneberg. He took over 50% of the vote. His victory came despite all the other parties, from the Social Democrats to the Greens and even the far-left Die Linke, urging their supporters to vote for the Christian Democratic Union. That victory was followed by the election of the AfD's first full-time mayor in the small town of Ragusetznitz. Polling showed 55% of Germans who were asked appreciate the AfD's clear policies. The party grew in popularity back in 2015 with its anti-immigration stance, following the arrival of thousands of refugees to Germany. Analysts say voter discontent with Germany's coalition government over issues like the economy and unemployment are also a contributing factor. Nationally, the party is now ahead of the Social Democrats and close behind the formerly dominant Christian Democrats. Could their next victory be a general election?
So let's discuss the AfD with our panel. We'll be starting out in Berlin, where we have Peter Kuras, who's a journalist who covers far-right extremism in Germany. Meanwhile, in Sweden, we have Dr. Andreas Unnefors. He's a professor of the history of ideas at Linnaeus University. Meanwhile, in London, we're joined by Dr. William Olkorn. He's an adjunct associate professor in politics and international relations at Richmond, the American University. And joining us from Athens, we have Dennis McShane, who's a former Europe Minister for the United Kingdom. Peter, I'm going to start off with you. The thing that seems to have sparked everyone's ire at the moment is some wins in local elections, but also the fact that AfD has overtaken the SPD and moved into sort of second spot in German politics. If you ask German voters how they intend to vote at the next election, AfD is currently polling on 20%. Should that be a concern for Germans?
I think it should clearly be a concern for Germans and for the rest of the world. I mean, it's a very far-right party that represents some radical positions and is willing to use some very unsavory means to advance those positions. With that said, I think the polling numbers can also be a little bit misleading. I think we see that the vote for the left and the center is split between a number of parties, and that those parties, in the event that the AfD were to come in at 20%, would likely form a coalition to try to keep the AfD out of power. But still, I think the general rightward shift, and particularly the willingness of other right-wing parties to adopt some of the tactics of the AfD, should be extremely concerning to all of us.
Andreas, are you equally concerned by the rise of the AfD in Germany, or do you think it's a little bit overblown?
I have the impression that some of the issues that drive the electorate towards the AfD are caused by frustrations with recent politics in Germany, pandemic politics, and also energy politics. It's an expression of frustration. I also believe that it is a larger problem in the former Eastern Eastern German states than it is in Germany altogether. But absolutely, I think we have to look this development as embedded into a larger right-wing shift of European electorates across the continent.
Andreas, is the issue then not that the main parties have been ignoring things that 20% of the voters clearly seem to care about? So is this not, if you like, how democracy works? 20% of the electorate says, we don't like this. The government says, tough, we're doing it anyway. And then suddenly you spring up with a slightly extremist party at one end of the spectrum or the other until the government gets its act in gear and starts paying attention to the voices of the voters.
Yeah, that could be one sort of interpreting it. But I mean, we have had successive governments where there have been huge coalitions. First the big coalition and then now the traffic light coalition. And I feel that the electoral support for AfD is rather an expression of frustration. The electorate does not identify with these kinds of large-scale coalition governments anymore and wants to have a clearer profile.
William, I see you nodding there.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting about this latest development is it's largely out of the mold what we see of other radical right parties, specifically looking at kind of discontent around climate policies more broadly. And I think it taps into frustrations around control within the electorate on these issues and feeling kind of robbed of agency. So I think it's going to be quite challenged for the mainstream parties to be able to row back on this.
What happens if the AfD, when the election comes along, does win something like 20%? Do the 80% of the other parties, do they try and work together and cut them out this time? Because there's always been this very serious cordon between the far-right parties and even the right-wing parties and the centrist parties and the left-wing parties. Do you think that's going to start to break down in Germany this time, William?
Well, I severely hope not. I mean, cordon sanitaires have been quite effective on the whole in other democracies, keeping these parties out, and specifically with the monitoring of certain wings of the AfD as extremist. There's been quite already a bit of state pushback, wanting not to vote for the party. But if the party becomes a sizable minority, I think that it'll be difficult for other mainstream parties to ignore the issues that they stand for.
Dennis, I saw some grimacing there.
Oh, not grimacing, not at all. I find it slightly amusing. John le Carre wrote the spy thriller writer from Britain, wrote a first book, a wonderful book called A Small Town in Germany. And a few weeks ago, a small town in Germany elected a fella from the AfD, a big, fat, beer-drinking fella with a 52% vote. What was his campaign about? No windmills in my little town. Now, frankly, I don't think Mussolini or Franco or Hitler really, they're all produce lots of hot wind and much worse. But the idea of fascism is about windmills is actually a bit silly. There are problems with 20th century European politics. It's much more of a mosaic than it was when I started standing for Parliament, when it was kind of monolithic left, monolithic centre-right, a few liberals. In France, until the 1970s, the biggest single party in the first round of elections was the Communist Party, who loved Stalin and Moscow, did whatever the Kremlin wanted. These things happen. I can go into far more details, obviously, as we discuss, but I'm not yet ready to start sort of saying it's all over and the jackboots are marching down the streets of Germany again.
So, Andreas, let me take this across to you. Where do you draw the line? Who counts as far right? Who counts as radical right? Who counts as hard right? Does it make a difference? Are these just, oh, we've been found out, let's come up with a new name?
Well, I mean, I think we have to see it as a scale where you really can say that you have very anti-democratic, proto-fascist, fascist values that really extreme and anti-democratic, but it's a gliding scale towards a conspiratorial populist right that, for instance, exploits people's frustrations or opposition against windmills and climate policies and so on. And that is what we are seeing right now. So therefore, I think that the issue of definitions is something that we as academics can deal with. What is important for understanding the behavior of the electorate is something different. It's to understand how certain populist actors are picking up hot button issues and are managing to get that wind into their sails. And then it doesn't matter. It could also be a far left party that would be able to exploit these issues and frustrations. But right now, AfD has since 2014 built up this huge support and platform. And that is important to keep in mind. And then, of course, the entire infrastructure is important to look at as well, because these populist right-wing parties have been very good at using social media and mobilize the electorate through alternative media.
Peter, has this not always been the case, though, with the fringe parties on the right? I remember an example in the United Kingdom with the British Nationalist Party, the BNP, which is now no longer here, where they were campaigning on hyperlocal politics. Is that what's going on here with AfD, because they're focusing on hyperlocal issues, or is it something different?
I certainly think that there's some success that comes from focusing on hyperlocal issues, as you put it. I think there's a feeling of responsiveness, particularly in the East, which has a long tradition of being burned by the Western parties, that has made them particularly susceptible to the AfD. With that said, I think that there is a sort of broader international question. There's something that we see repeated certainly throughout Germany, but also in the United States and in much of the rest of Europe, which is this willingness to play on fear of refugees, fear of cultural or ethnic difference as a way to garner votes. And I feel strongly that that is taking place not only within the AfD, but also increasingly within centrist parties, and even in part on the left. We see Die Linke now has an element that is pushing strongly towards that sort of xenophobic approach. And it seems like that's just very successful on social media. It seems that that's much more successful than any other kind of left-wing approach towards gathering votes right now.
Peter, that's certainly what got AfD some of its votes in the last election, because, of course, we had the immigration row that was going on with long queues of Syrian refugees, of course, attempting to get into Europe. Do you think that's going to play for them, though, in a couple of years' time at the next election? Or has that issue subsided and they have to focus on something else? AfD certainly morphed quite a lot. It was originally, say, an anti-European Union party right back at its start, and it seems to have sort of found new lines and new things to harp on at each different election. Is that fair, or am I misreading the situation?
I think they've certainly found new things to harp on in each different election, but there has been a consistent drift to the right on the part of the AfD. I mean, you started off with a number of fairly moderate people who've since been pushed out of the party. The extremist positions are growing louder and more vocal. I think that there's good reason to think that they're doubling down on the sort of xenophobic tactics that have served them so well.
Well, let me bring this across to William. William, you think this is spreading out across the rest of Europe as well? We've seen the rise of Vox, we've seen the rise of Golden Dawn, that's Spain, that's Greece, Sweden Democrats as well. You mentioned the cordon sanitaire in your last answer. Of course, it seems to have broken down in Sweden.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that this is part of a broader trend, especially on fragmentation on the right. You see these radical parties kind of vying for position and trying to outflank the mainstream right. So it's the challenge of the extent to which the mainstream right conforms to this form of kind of post-material cultural politics that we're seeing in their programs. And these radical parties tend to own these issues and exploit them for opportunistic gain. So it's part of a game that they've been playing since the foundation of the Front National nearly 50 years ago.
Dennis, you don't seem to be so sure on that.
Only to say there was a famous poster put up on lots and lots of boarding houses, small pensions we call them now, maybe in the 1950s. It said, "No dogs, no coloured, no Irish." There's always been that appeal to an anti-foreigner, anti-immigrant, anti-outsider element. The Daily Mail, our British paper, was openly anti-Jewish in the 1930s, saying, "Stop the Jews from Germany coming to take over Britain." segue today forward, and you'll have the AfD and other right saying it's the Muslims who are taking over. That was a campaign of Eric Zemmour and partly of Marine Le Pen in the French presidential election. It's called the Great Replacement theory. And so it goes on, but it never actually works. Marine Le Pen, I remember hearing Jean-Marie Le Pen, her father, speaking 30 odd years ago, and it was a roaring celebration of anti-Jewishness. And Marine Le Pen, also very anti-Muslim. Now she's quietened down. Get out of the European Union. Ditch the euro, she said. And then Brexit happened. And they all saw, oh my God, that's destroyed the right in Europe. The BNP, as I think you said, have disappeared. Boris Johnson's disappeared. All those Brexit prime ministers have fallen into the dustbin of history. And being anti-European, getting rid of the euro from France or Italy. Meloni is the same. So I don't like it, don't get me wrong. I wish everybody was tolerant and spoke like the bishops and the priests and intellectual left-wing professors. I love them all, but politics is a nasty, smelly, dirty business. I repeat, I'm yet to be convinced. A lot of the nastiest politics have come from people like Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Jeremy Corbyn in my country allowed the Labour Party to go anti-Semitic for 4, 5, 6 years. The Republican Party in America can it clean itself up from Donald Trump? We don't know. Joe Biden is one. Where I am in Greece, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, a conservative, but refuses any alliance with the far right as one. In Britain, it looks as if the Labour Party is going to win. So the notion that everywhere, as I say, the far right are on the march, I just caution. Don't want to be proved wrong. Not convinced I'm right, but I just my own Fingerspitzgefühl, my fingertip feeling. I'm not yet convinced that all of Europe is going hard right.
Okay, let me bring in a quote here. I've got a quote from Robert Sesselman, who's the AfD candidate and winner of the election in Sonneberg. He had this to say.
I can promise you that things will get better with us. We will make sure this district grows closer to its citizens again. We will make sure policy is made for the businesses, for the service providers and for craftsmen. This is what I stand for. And forget everything you've heard so far. Put me to the test. What's important to us is success in the years to come, and we're working towards that. Thank you very much for your support.
Peter, I'm going to take this across to you. Every time there's a right-wing party crops up, doesn't matter whether it's UKIP, whether it's Vox, whether it's Golden Dawn, any of them, they all get labelled as fascist or ultra-right-wing or far-right, and then somehow they end up in government like Giorgia Meloni, and they just seem to be a different flavour of centrist. Or is that guaranteed? Are they getting co-opted by the system? Or have we just been lucky so far?
I think there's a little bit of both, maybe. I mean, I think the problem is it's very, very difficult to actually govern using far-right ideology. I mean, it doesn't provide you a roadmap for much of anything. And, as with other ideologues, they tend to make a lot of promises that are difficult, if not impossible, to fulfill. And because a lot of it is seeded by hatred and seeded by divisiveness, that's a great way to win elections. It's a terrible way to govern. So I think that there is some sense in which power seems to moderate people. But with that said, as we've seen in the United States, and I think in Britain too, the damage can be real from these far-right parties. I mean, it's nothing to have people on the borders to Europe drowning. It's nothing to have the climate policies set back. It's nothing to foment more division in society. I think we see very real consequences to the far right coming to power, even if they're not quite as apocalyptic as we might expect.
Andreas, I'm going to bring it across to you. What do you make of the fact that every time one of these right-wing parties... do we run a risk here of trying to think of a way of putting it, the left-wing intellectual press, the Guardian newspapers across Europe, do we run a risk of them being boy who cried wolf every time they label a party fascist?
Yeah, maybe we should develop better tools of analysis. And I was thinking about one thing that Dennis said and we brought up before, and and that is why are these parties and movements able to mobilize their voters? And I think it harks back to the pandemic, where we saw new alliances being born around conspiracy theories about the government and the elites and so on. I think this is a very important aspect that explains why the AfD has become larger. So it's not that we are seeing a real traditional shift towards traditional right-wing positions, but it is more that conspiracy theories and conspiratorial meaning-making has arrived in the mainstream. But what happens when conspiracy theorists come to power? I mean, you have the best example in the United States, of course, and that will spell havoc. But then, of course, there's the other opportunity, and that is, or possibility, and that is that these people in power will fail because they don't know how to actually enact politics that serve the people. I mean, we have a very telling example in Sweden right now. Since last year, we have the truly far-right party, Sweden Democrats, in the shadows, and they have written contracts with the ruling party on most policy issues in Sweden. And we can see how many of their ideas are failing in reality. And why do they fail? Because they are built on wrong premises, for instance, conspiratorial meaning making. And I think we should develop better tools to analyze that.
William, are you in agreement with that?
Yeah, I think what we've seen in Germany is this conflation between some of the more kind of conspiratorial street movements, anti-lockdown movements, and the parties like the AfD. We saw that with Pegida as well, kind of going back a bit further, this anti-Islam protest movement. So I think it's, as Andreas was saying, it's good to analyse this in a kind of broader continuity of broader movements that we're seeing kind of aligning, and also that point in terms of normalisation and mainstreamisation. I think this is part of why this is becoming so kind of banal, as it were, which is a fairly tricky position to be in, to say the least. So I think, just to add a final point, I think a lot of these parties say and try to make themselves as standing up for the ordinary person, and this idea of kind of standing up for the ordinary people is what a lot of these right-wing populist parties have been doing now for the past 50 or 60 years. So it's quite a key part of their playbook to play up that kind of being part of the kind of common sense or the ordinary person.
Peter, if I bring this across to you, to what degree should the main parties be held responsible for the rise of the right? Because clearly, if 20% of people are voting for these fringe parties, there must be something, some need that is not being met, some policy that they're not following through on, especially since, as you've already mentioned, in the specific case of Germany, they keep rising up in Eastern Germany, which was deindustrialized, which did suffer larger amounts of unemployment levels. Can we lay the blame for this at, say, the feet of the SPD or the CDU or the CSU?
I think there's a lot of blame that should go properly to the main parties in Germany. And I think, to be fair, maybe we should say it's a problem that extends beyond party structures into a sort of general uncertainty about how to address the problems faced in the world right now on the part of centrist political parties. I don't think anybody has a really compelling idea about how we can address the problems with climate change while also maintaining the parts of our quality of life that are very important to us and essential to our culture and identity. I don't think anybody really has an idea about how to deal with the war in Ukraine in a way that respects human rights and respects Ukrainian sovereignty without threatening to expand the violence further.
Dennis, sorry, Peter, we're running out of time. So, Dennis, let me quickly bring you back in for the last point. What do you think the main parties should do about the rise of these fringe parties, whether it's either on the right or on the left? But at the moment, people seem to be most focused on the ones on the right.
They are. You certainly have to listen to them, but there's no use adopting racist attitudes. There was no problem with Jews coming into Britain in the 1930s, and there's no problem with sensible refugee policies and immigration here. I would say, don't go and create failed states in Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and sub-Saharan Africa. Look at what we can do to get more jobs and prosperity to those areas. Look at why we can't even solve the West Balkans. That's Albania, Kosovo, Bosnia, North Macedonia. And there Germany has a huge responsibility because it will not take any action. Angela Merkel has been asleep at the wheel for far too long. Long Merkel still exists. I look at Germany, I still see Merkelism everywhere. We need clear, coherent, internationalist and social democratic policies from Germany and the rest of Europe. But then I'm old-fashioned. I think social democracy has got a better offer than this extreme identity, anti-immigrant, anti-European right.
Peter, Andreas, William, Dennis, thank you very much, all four of you, for joining me today.
Thank you.
I'm afraid that is all we have time for the show. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just head over there and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and all of the team, thank you for watching, and goodbye.